All right, well, this is week 12 update, fall semester 2024. Thank you so much for watching these videos and following along, supporting me in my educational journey. And hopefully you're gaining an education as well as we go through this. This is to do 3 classes a semester is costing me about 3,500 bucks every semester. So hopefully you're gaining knowledge yourself from what I'm spending my time and money doing, so that I can learn, but then hopefully you can learn as well and be enriched. So this week in my interfaith class, we talked about some of the challenges that interfaith leadership run into sometimes. There's sometimes challenges because faiths maybe not see each other as equals. They see them as the other person. They're the enemy, kind of an idea. So we want to do our best to overcome that and realize that while they may believe something different, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are evil or the enemy. Basically, they have a different set of beliefs, and it's okay if they believe something different because it's their choice. It's their agency to choose that. The more we can encourage that kind of an idea, the better, I think, in the long run, for interfaith and just for dialogue and understanding. Basically, don't see each other in competition, like it used to be in the 1800s. See each other as cooperation, opportunities to come together. In fact, I found out, we learned also about there is a tri-faith community in Nebraska. I did not know this was a real thing, but in Nebraska there is a tri-faith community. You can go look it up and see this as well. There was a Jewish community that the building that they were meeting in was aging. It was getting old. It needed a lot of repairs. And they were trying to figure out, how can we allay some of these costs? How can we make this more cost effective for us? And realized, you know what, if we share like a same parking lot as other buildings, that would cut back some of our cost, as the parking lot size at least. The building will be theirs, but then they'll have to, they could at least delay out some of those costs of the parking lot. So they thought, why don't we build a network? Like, let's get 2 or 3 other churches and then we'll share the parking lot, basically. And so that's what they decided to do. So they actually reached out to a Muslim group and said, hey, we're going to build this new building and do this. Would you like to build on it? And we can share the parking lot and encourage conversation and good positive dialogue between our religions and help people out. And the Muslims are like, actually, this is a great idea, because we were thinking of building something that could be used to educate more people on the good parts of Islam. And so they said this would be a great idea. They went to a Catholic church and said, hey, because, so Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are also seen in the classification of what's known as Abrahamic religions. They all claim descendancy from Abraham. Jews and Islamic Muslims literally from Abraham, from different sons of Abraham. But then Christians believe in the covenant of Abraham as well, to be his kind of a spiritual family, if you will. Oh man, I got a hair in my eye or something there. That's crazy. So they decided to come together, and so they wanted to complete this by having a Christian church there too. They went to the Catholic church, and the Catholic church says, well, we'd like to do this, but we're really trying to get our diocese out of debt and taken care of that way, so we can't, we're kind of risk adverse at the point as far as getting into a new building and doing all this stuff. So they said no. So I thought, well, who else can we talk to? Let's go talk to another religion. So the Episcopalian church basically said, yeah, we'd like to do this. So they built the 3rd building, and now they have these 3 churches sharing a similar space, parking lot. They have different buildings, but they can increase interfaith dialogue between them and discussions and things, which is cool. So kind of a fun idea that they have. We'll see if it catches on in other places as well. But that was kind of a neat way to see it. So in my Mormonism class, boy, did we cover a lot. Oh my gosh, we have a lot to talk about. So let's get into a few things here. This is the time period in American history where we are post Civil War. So Civil War has happened. We've moved past that time period. After the Civil War, the manufacturing in America was able to really pick back up and move once they were able to get the North and South reconciled together, get the whole country moving in the same pace, working together. You know, the textiles, the North and South would work together on those things with manufacturing and everything else. And steel industry started coming into play. Railroads started to become a thing as they were able to make cheaper steel. The economy started to boom inside America. It started to grow and boom a lot. New York, as one historian in a documentary we watched said, New York became New York after the Civil War. Before the Civil War, it was a big place, but it wasn't what we'd think of today. It became more of that. New York became America after the Civil War. It just boomed. So we have lots of industry. We have tons of immigration coming in. We have the Irish coming in. We have other groups coming in, other Catholic groups, Italians, and other groups are coming in. And Mormons are still immigrating through as well. So lots of activity. The slums grew, unfortunately. The inequality really went rampant. So the Irish, in fact, were carted off. As soon as Irish got to America, they were basically, their luggage was picked up and they were taken to the slums and dropped off there to live. And so they weren't given a big chance of becoming a more integrated part of America at that time. It took a little while to get that integrated in, mainly because a lot of the Irish were Catholic. The Irish Protestants did a little bit better, but Irish Catholics were kind of a double whammy against them at the time. So that took some time. The slums were pretty bad for a while there, but the wealth concentration grew. So this is also the robber baron era, getting into robber baron timeframes with Carnegie, Rockefeller, those guys, oil, steel, those kinds of industries start to really take off. So instead of working on a farm, working as a craftsman, you were a laborer. They just needed someone to fill a seat and put something together on an assembly line. You were just part of an assembly line. So unskilled labor became more popular, but it also became less humanized. And that was part of the problem that they ran into with this inequality issues. People were seen as, you're a worker, you are less than the boss and the owners, and so class distinctions kind of became a thing within economies. One thing that came out of a lot of this is what's known as the social gospel. So this was a concept that religion as a whole was starting to transition at this time. We see it in Christianity, we see it in Judaism as well, where things are changing as America is growing and becoming more American, if you will. So the social gospel had a few ideas, and let's talk about some of these. I got my notes out here. Social gospel tended to believe in what's called a post-millennial idea. Now, what this means, you'll hear sometimes these terms, post-millennial, pre-millennial. What they're talking about, millennial means the coming of Christ, the time when life gets good and everything's amazing. The social gospel believed that Christ would come at the end of the millennium. So the millennium will run, then Christ comes. That's post-millennial theory. The fundamentalists we're going to get into here in a little bit were pre-millennial, meaning that Christ will come at the beginning of the millennium, and then we'll have the millennium reign, basically. So those are two ideas that were going back and forth at this time. They believed that the millennium, so the post-millennial idea was that you could work to bring about the coming of Christ. The millennium was reserved for the time to prepare the people for the coming of Christ. And that's the more they worked on improving their religion, improving people's, get people to believe and repent and do those things, then the more they're prepared for the coming of Christ at the end of the millennium. So this was a lot of Protestant reform that we see happening as well within Christianity. So like Congregationalists, Episcopalians, Northern Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, they were involved. And what they started to do was they started to shift the idea of sin. Sin wasn't so much a personal thing as it was a collective thing. So a community could sin. The community could do things that would cause harm for other people, the community as a whole could be held accountable for those problems and those sins. So this is where sin was seen more as like public morality type idea. So as a public, as a community, what are we doing to deal with the morals of the times and things, and the community could be seen as sinful because of these problems and challenges as a group. So sin is the wrong done to a class of people is kind of a terminology I thought that they would have. So redemption was the turn from self to God and humanity, basically. The kingdom of God would be humanity organized according to the will of God, basically. So that's more of some of these ideas of the social gospel that came out. This also encouraged more social ideas and concepts within a church. So churches went from just being a building where you showed up and you listened to the preacher preach and then you went home. Churches started to change their structure to have classrooms inside them where there's more individual instruction that could be given. Specific things for different groups could be done. Gymnasiums became part of churches, big auditoriums and chapels. So not these little small local churches, bigger churches where the church itself, the building, could be used for social events. So social connections became more of a thing because of these ideas in the social gospel. And this led to some challenges because from a theological standpoint, we see two camps of people. So there's the modern idea, modernists' ideas of religion, and then the fundamentalist ideas of religion. So modernist ideas are more progressive, if you will. They follow more the social gospel, social. You aren't just you are a part of this community, and that community is important. It also follows more intellectual and artistic movements to begin in the 1920s. So you could see modernism as this continuation of the Enlightenment age from 17 and 1800s. Modernists were a little disillusioned after World War I. They struggled with what do we do because World War I was just so bad. They're like, is this world actually getting better? So that's part of that post-millennial idea, is the world is getting better as we go towards the coming of Christ. Whereas the fundamentalists, which are more traditional values, they want to believe what has already been thought of. They believe in the pre-millennial, meaning the world's getting worse, and then Christ comes, and then it'll get better, basically. So they're like, how could things be getting better? It's supposed to be getting worse until Christ comes. So there's these two ways to think about that. Fundamentalists also tended to believe the literal translation of the Bible, like the Bible is the literal word of God. It is perfect. It is univocal. It is the utmost authority in matters of theology and religion. And so they really focused on that. The modernists went, well, we're not sure the Bible is perfect. We think there's some challenges there. So modernism tended to do a little bit more with looking at the Bible from a scientific standpoint as well, not just seeing the Bible is it. We just take the Bible as it is and we accept it as it is, and there's nothing else. This was part of that dynamic back and forth between these two camps, and we see these ideas, like it says in Judaism, we saw this. In fact, let's see, the gentleman's name in Judaism. I thought I had it written down here. Let's see. Maybe I didn't write it down. There was a gentleman who was a rabbi. Jews were coming to America in large amounts. They were part of that group of immigrants coming to America, leaving Europe, because Europe was passing laws in the early 1900s that were saying, you can't, if you're a Jew, you can't run a business. You can't do this or that. You can't, they put a lot of restrictions on Jews. Like Germany had a lot through that time frame. Germany was one of the last countries in Europe to form in what we know it today as a European country. It was a lot of clans, tribal family groups over there, the Germanic tribes for a while. And then they didn't come together to the late 1800s, and they were a big advocate of, we want to maintain pure Germanic blood. And because they were the last to form, a lot of the other countries had kind of kicked out the Jews because they saw them as a lesser people, not as good as their citizens. And so the Germany became the vacuum that the Jews went to because there weren't laws against them. They didn't have a formal organized government yet. But after they did, then they started to push the Jews out too. So a lot of Jews came to America because you couldn't own land. If you were a Jew, you weren't allowed to start a business. You weren't allowed to own land. You come to America, you have all the land you want. We got so much land, it's ridiculous. It's coming out our ears, literally. So they moved to America and did more here. The problem is as they came to America and started to Americanize, the challenge is there's a clash with traditional Judaistic ideas, like foods, kosher foods, and other things. And so, am I Jewish or am I American? And there was a culture clash. The challenge happened there, and so there was a rabbi, and I could have sworn I wrote his name down, but I don't see it in my notes, unfortunately. There was a rabbi that he focused his efforts on realizing that Judaism needed to modernize. Judaism needed to come into the 20th century, basically, in the 1900s, and adjust how it did things. So instead of praying only in Hebrew, he prayed in English or in German because a lot of them were German Jews. Um, so he modernized prayer so that people could understand it because not as many people knew Hebrew anymore. He started to shift again the ideas of what foods to eat. Do we need to really be so strict? So in his mind, he separated out there's core doctrines like the Ten Commandments and some of those things that are like core doctrines to Judaism. They need to be followed. But then there's cultural ideas around Judaism, and they maybe don't need to be followed, like kosherness and other things. So he began this movement to reform Judaism in America to help the Jews to see a more modern understanding of their religion, basically. And so that was part of the clash that they were seeing. Again, Christianity, modernism versus fundamentalism, same thing that's going on. The fundamentalists wanted to restrict women's rights. They wanted women were responsible for the moral welfare of the nation. They needed to stay where they were at. They needed to wear long dresses, skirts. In the 1920s, the length of skirts started to shorten up to where it was just below the knee for women, and all the fundamentalists were like, "Oh, that's going to tempt men because they can see your ankles and your calf muscles and things, and that's going to be a temptation for men. We don't like that. We want you to stay covered up. We want you to not be a temptation to men." Things like that. In fact, I believe this is a similar time frame actually when sewing machines were destroyed. Sewing machines started coming out late 1800s, and people saw them as a tool of the devil because they believed if women could get all their work done and have time left in the day to do other stuff, that they would basically just start stealing everybody else's husbands. And they didn't want that, so they destroyed the sewing machines for a while there. That's probably part of this dynamic of modernism versus fundamentalism that they saw. The bob haircuts, the sleeveless dresses, those things that were becoming really popular. Women's fashion was changing considerably in the 1920s, and the fundamentalists saw all of it as bad. All of it was wrong. All of it was bad. No work, no birth control, no work outside the home for women. That was more of what the fundamentalists wanted. We need to stick with what we've got. And this idea of progressivism versus fundamentalism is something that religions go through all the time. Some people want to hold on to what they've believed in the past, and some people want to think in more modern terms about what they're doing now. Even in LDS tradition, I think we can easily see this with the debates through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 90s. Boyd K. Packer, Ezra Taft Benson, other groups have been really pushing and staunch against changing traditions and changing values, but yet now, like President Nelson has changed a lot. President Hinckley's changed some things. There's always this dynamic of fundamentalists versus modernists that are always going back and forth. This is how the sausage of religion gets made, is this debate between these two groups. So that's what happened. So Mormonism, again, went through a lot of transition at the same time as well. Theology had to be standardized. And I didn't realize this. I read the book about the Reed Smoot trials. Kathleen Flake, I think was her name. She wrote this great book. I mentioned it, I think, last week, in fact, about the Reed Smoot trials. Amazing book. I never realized in her book, she mentions that one of the things that Joseph Fielding Smith, when he was a prophet in the early 1900s, realized that we don't have a standardized theology in Mormonism. We know how we're different from Christianity, but we don't have a standardized one for ourselves. And there's lots of little ideas and thoughts that are kind of threading out there. And so he decided we need to come back to the center. We need to standardize our theology. Excuse me. One of the ways they did that was, of course, James E. Talmage. He wrote a series of books like Jesus the Christ, Articles of Faith, and others to help pull back and say, here's the standard theology. Here's where we're at. That kind of became the main point of bringing it back. James E. Talmage's books did a lot to help standardize things. So that's when, it was in the 1920s when the church actually officially came out with a handbook. So the handbook's only a little over 100 years old right now, basically, for the church. They didn't have a handbook through the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. They just went off of who had the best connection to an apostle, back to the prophet and apostle that originally said it. Whoever had the closest citation back to them was probably right. And that's what they did. So now they said, no, we can't do that anymore. We need to standardize our theology, help people understand where we are. What do we believe? What do we not believe? How does this work? And there's a lot of things that changed because of this. One was identity of God. In Joseph Smith's time, in the 1800s, the terms Jehovah and Elohim were used somewhat simultaneously. Joseph Smith interchangeably used Jehovah and Elohim to represent God. And so there was God the Father, basically. So you have to, when you're reading Joseph Smith, you have to realize that, is that God the Father or Jesus? Because we think of Jehovah as Jesus today and Elohim as God the Father. But in Joseph Smith's day, those were somewhat interchangeable terms. So just realize that when you're reading Joseph Smith's writings, you have to think about it. Is he meaning God the Father, or is he meaning Jesus in this because of that? Another one that came out was pre-earth life. So this is something that's somewhat unique to LDS ideas, but that we were spirits before we lived on earth. We were kind of a spirit family in heaven. We have God the Father, which means a pre-existent world does presuppose women pre-existed as well. So a heavenly mother starts to come into play in this idea. So there's these other, like, see how these kind of branch off and work with each other. So then Joseph Smith and the early apostles started looking at this idea of an intelligence is something that when our heavenly parents build a spirit, create a spirit body, an intelligence inhabits it. And then that's the intelligence and the spirit body together. And then when we come to mortality, we gain a physical body. So there's like three entities, nested inside each other in a way. So they started to develop that idea. Interesting, the word of wisdom was re-emphasized and brought back up. Word of wisdom has had a really interesting history. And this is something I've specifically studied because I find the word of wisdom really interesting. The word of wisdom started, we all heard the famous stories of word of wisdom beginning as Emma Smith was a little unhappy with all the mess the men had with spitting their tobacco out and missing the pot, as well as the cloud of smoke and the smells and odors from the cigars and things they were smoking in their meetings. Joseph had already kind of like, yeah, this is not good. Maybe we should do something different. But Emma's like, this is ridiculous. I'm having to clean up after you guys, and this is a filthy mess. So he looked at it. Now, at the same time, there was a very large idea and following in America to deal with getting rid of vices. So alcohol, tobacco, there's already a huge movement to say we need to prohibit these. We need to severely limit what we're doing with these because they're a bad thing for our society. So the word of wisdom came on a trend that was similar. It was 1833 that it was utilized and brought about. Prohibits alcohol, tobacco, hot drinks, meaning tea and coffee. And tea has been specifically mentioned in 2014 as anything from the Camellia sinensis plant, which is your green teas, your black teas, your matcha teas, those kinds of things are there. You should encourage fruits and vegetables and grains. Meat should be eaten sparingly, but should be allowed. It was interesting. In 1906, they actually changed the sacrament from wine to water in 1906. Uh, Around that time in the 1920s, an area, the word of wisdom was then added to temple recommend questions also. So it took a while. When the word of wisdom first came out, it was given not by commandment, as it says in section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants, but it was in 1959, I think it is, that Brigham Young made it a commandment. But what they did was they said that we've got a problem here because we have a lot of people who are addicted to alcohol and tobacco. If we just come out and go, it's now commandments, you're cut off if you don't follow it, it's going to cause a lot of problems for these people. And we don't want to disrupt their life and excuse me, cause lots of challenges for them. So what they did was they said all new people, all young people who haven't grown up with this vice, it's absolute. You need to follow this. For the older people, the discretion to the bishops and stake presidents was give them a little leeway. Are they trying to get rid of these habits? Are they trying to break those chains and do better? If they're trying to do better, it's okay if they do a little bit of smoking, a little bit of drinking. That's not going to preclude them from their temple recommend. It wasn't until I think in the 1940s, 1950s era that they just said, nope, by this time you should have figured it out by now. Those who grew up in those eras where it was allowed have all passed away. Everybody should be following it. And then it got more strict on that for your temple recommend. But for a while there were several decades where there was leeway in that one for the older generations who grew up in a time before the word of wisdom was a commandment. So it's kind of fascinating how it's not just a rule that was hard, fast rule that was put in place, that they looked at it and said, how can we help people to apply this better and have some mercy with people there? It was really cool. It was interesting with this idea of word of wisdom because the word of wisdom was seen also as a way for Mormons to be viewed as modern in society instead of this ancient religion, following polygamy and weird paganism stuff. It was seen as a more modern religion because of the word of wisdom. It was following some of these more modern trends. And that helped Mormons to be seen as Americans, as seen as more modern people, basically, because of that. In fact, a lot of people use the word of wisdom as an example of proof that Joseph Smith was a prophet, because when he gave that in 1833, and what that has meant and how it has helped, because now science is caught up to where the word of wisdom was, and now we understand scientifically why the word of wisdom is a good idea. So a lot of people use that to prove Joseph Smith is a real prophet and that the church is progressive in its thinking. What's interesting, I didn't think about this, is word of wisdom was also used as a retrenchment tool. So if you've ever heard of the Young Women's Retrenchment Society, that was created, we talked about that last week, to help young women not be distracted by the worldly fashions and things. So the word of wisdom was seen as a retrenchment, a way to pull the saints back, to not let them get distracted by worldly stuff and pull them back. And it was a protection from the problems of modernity and society that were bad, basically. So the word of wisdom grew in its understanding at that time as well. Sealings started to undergo some changes. So sealings is an interesting point you have to think about. When sealings first came out, the idea is creating connections to build eternal families. Polygamy was seen as celestial marriage, which is a sealing. It's, you get married is a ceiling, and then polygamy was like higher than monogamy in value. So you get to the top of the celestial kingdom with polygamy versus monogamy, you get a lower part of the celestial kingdom. But sealings was this idea of building these family connections. Now, while they did look at sealing their, I want my kids sealed to me so we can be a family, they thought about this also as this idea of priesthood. So this term kind of got distorted, if you will, that they started seeing if you're an important priesthood person, being sealed to you could help me. So there's a concept that a man's priesthood could help other people come along with him. And I think this is where we get the problem with that women, because they don't hold the priesthood, they come along with their husband's priesthood. and the family can come along. So if you're sealed to this man, then you can come along with his priesthood. And so this became distorted. Families were being married to each other, like some men were being married to others, like Joseph and Emma had a couple of church leaders sealed to them as sons, even though they're not blood relatives of each other. So they started creating these artificial, what we would call today more of an artificial family tree, using sealings as the binding tool to pull this together. So it was a different family tree than a genealogical one, than what we'd see from, genetics and descendancy of family. And so this was part of the change in sealings that they had back then. They saw polygamy as more better than monogamy. Women would talk about the advantages of polygamy. We talked about that last time as well. Some of those advantages and perceived that they saw. The problem with polygamy, though, is that it takes love out of the equation to an extent. So if you think of romanticism in marriage, that's hard in polygamy because you might not see your husband very often. And so you spend most of your time not seeing your husband and you longing for those needs and that romanticism and not getting it much. And by the time he comes around, because he's already dealt with all his other wives and his other kids and things, not to mention the law chasing him, he's exhausted. So, and sometimes because they had to move to outside the United States, leave wives, so they abandoned whole parts of their family and stuff and wouldn't see each other for years. So romantic relationships were not a part. They're just like, if you're going to get into polygamy, just realize romance is what you sacrifice. One of the things you sacrifice in polygamy. In the 19th century, so the 1800s, their priesthood ideas changed as well. So we see sealings quite different. That was more standardized coming into the early 20th century. The 1900s priesthood was also something that was changing. Women were seen in the 1800s as not having equal priesthood with the men, because priesthood were ordained to an office in the priesthood, but women partook in the blessings and opportunities of priesthood equally with men, and they could, through their ordinances, they were endowed with power of priesthood, and so they could then exercise that power to bless the lives of others. So yes, in the 1800s, women were allowed to give blessings of healing to others. So in today's world, we think of blessings of healing as, oh, my kid is sick, I need to call my ministering brothers to come over, or I need to call 2 men to come over to administer a priesthood blessing to my sick child. In the 1800s, women were giving each other blessings, most specifically around childbirth and pregnancy. So women that were sick, women that were dealing with hard pregnancies, women giving birth, the other women would come in, sometimes using some oil, anointing oil on their head, put their hands on their head and give a blessing to these other women. There's many stories of this. In fact, there's many stories of prophets getting blessings from their mothers that is mentioned, and they don't see anything wrong with it. So it is something that's in today's culture of pro-feminism and things. It's seen as quite a controversial change in the church when that went away. What the church did basically was they said, we need to rethink this and understand our theology better. So priesthood is conferred on the men. Women, through their ordinances, have access to priesthood, but it's that idea of it's through the men's priesthood that they get the blessings. So they can't give the blessings, but they get the blessings. So which goes back to these other cultural ideas of women, in order to be seen as full people, have to be married to a man. Again, that's the 1800s. That's been that way for centuries, and that's just how they thought. So it became men have the priesthood, women get the blessings of the priesthood as they are married to a man who has the priesthood. So that's where some of those ideas kind of coalesce that we've had till even to this day, basically. What's really cool, though, is James E. Talmage has an article. This was put in the Young Women's Journal in 1914. It's called "The Eternity of Sex." Really good article, well worth reading. You can Google it, James E. Talmage, Eternity of Sex, and you can find it online and read it. in it, he actually mentions in there that while men get the priesthood by ordinance, the ordination, that through the covenants that women make, through the ordinances in the temple, women have the ability to have priesthood opportunities as well. So President Nelson's concepts that he's using in today's societies, in today's General Conference talks, where he talks about women being able to use priesthood authority through their ordinances and things, they're trying to bring these concepts back. James E. Talmage talked about it 100 years ago. And so this isn't a rethinking that President Nelson's doing today. He's just not reinterpreting, but he's helping us to rethink through this and go, oh wait, here's where the truth is. Let's unpack some of these cultural issues off. And so that's an important point. So lots of stuff that was happening, just a lot of these doctrines and ideas that were starting to come about as we go through this time up to 1930. So now we're getting towards the Great Depression era, where we're going to start dealing with the Depression and other challenges. I'm sure that's next week. We're going to talk more about that. But this is a huge time where Mormonism transitioned a lot. So we had from 1890 to 1930, of course, Manifesto in 1890 came out from President Woodruff. And then Joseph Fielding Smith did a second manifesto around 1906 to definitively say, guys, stop doing polygamous stuff. We need to knock this off. And a lot of that came because of the Reed Smoot trial, because Joseph Fielding Smith was on the stand of Congress testifying for 3 days in front of Congress. And that's, again, these ideas of we need to standardize. Church attendance was struggling as well because they were so far branched out that women were organizing and doing quite well. They had a lot of good organizations. Relief Society was really doing a lot with welfare and other things for the church. The women were running the welfare for the church. Basically, the women were doing a lot of things for the church. The men, on the other hand, were struggling because a lot of them were farmers. They lived a ways away from the church as these settlements grew and expanded out. And so men's attendance at activities were really, really low. They just weren't coming in to do their church attendance, go to their meetings. Now, back then, of course, you met during the week as well. Sunday was like sacrament meeting, but then like your priesthood meetings and primary and Relief Society meetings were during the week. And so attendance was down. And so they're trying to say, we need the men to step up. The women are giving the blessings. The women are doing all the welfare work, and the women are encouraging missionary work, and the women are doing all these other things. And the men are struggling at what they're doing. And so it's this time from 1890 to 1930 that the church starts to shift and go, we need to be more institutionalized. We need to standardize our doctrine. We need to kind of pare back some of these things and get more down to the basics and start from there and go at that point. And that's where the church handbook came into play. That's where, again, women were discouraged from giving blessings after this time period. They made men more responsible for things going on. These other ideas of women have access to priesthood, but it's through their husbands, which has been debunked. President Nelson has debunked that one since 2018. Women have priesthood, not ordained to an office of the priesthood, but have priesthood through their ordinances and covenants. And I think people are still trying to grapple with that today and get rid of some of those older traditions and improve themselves and move forward in those ideas in today's society. So a lot of fun stuff that we got to talk about. Holy cow, so many things happening in this time period for America as well as for the changes in religion. One of the things we talked about in this time period, also in Christianity, part of this fundamentalism versus more modernism idea, I left this here for the end on purpose, was what's known as the monkey trials. If you're like, ooh, what is that? I've never heard that name before. Let's talk about this, okay? Again, more modernism and fundamentalism were these two perspectives of Christianity that were going on at the time. At the same time as this stuff was happening, Charles Darwin wrote his Theory of Evolution book, which the modernists saw, oh, this is great. The other trend that they were seeing in here is modernists were using science. So they were using a scientific perspective when looking at the Bible. The problem was when they looked at the Bible from a scientific perspective, they said, can this be really true? So a couple of examples that they talked about was One is, did Moses really write the first 5 books of the Bible? It is traditionally held Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But here's the thing that's interesting about it is, in the book of Exodus, it also tells us about the death of Moses. So could Moses write about his death before he died? Or was he already dead? And then somebody else wrote that in. So obviously, while we could say Moses compiled those writings together, obviously there's another scribal layer that has gone over the top of it. So that means it's not we're not getting directly from the prophet, we're getting through a scribe who has added to the story, who completed part of the other pieces. So that was a challenge that they had. And there was many other things like that that started popping up. Like Jonah in the well is a common one that scientists look at. Did Jonah really get swallowed by a well? Would that have, I mean, is that literally possible to be swallowed and then spit back out 3 days later? Wouldn't he have died? Is that possible? And other stories like that. So the fundamentalists, again, believed the Bible was perfect and absolute. It is the definitive thing. We don't need to question anything in the Bible. We just take it as it is and go. The scholars are looking at this going, I don't know if we can. I think we need to think a little bit deeper about the Bible and realize that maybe it's not as perfect as we think. There's contradiction in the Bible. There's different authors in the Bible, and they say things from their time frames and their perspectives that contradict each other. So they start to see this. So scholarship in the Bible starts to come out, and it really, really causes problems for the fundamentalists. So what happened in the monkey trial is in Tennessee, there was a law that was passed at this time that said you are not allowed to teach Darwin's theory in class. We want we want people to focus on teaching the Bible and not other things. Science doesn't inform the Bible. The Bible tells us about science, kind of an idea. And so that was the fundamentalism idea starting to take hold, and laws were passed that were more pro-fundamentalist. Well, there was a science teacher in Tennessee that he violated this law by talking with his students about the theory of evolution. The parents freaked out, everybody freaked out, school board freaked out, and they took this guy to court over this. They sued him. And the monkey trial is this trial of this man. And 2 major people that played in this trial. One was a gentleman, Brian was his last name. He was a former he was a senator, U.S. senator, very staunch, Bible-loving evangelical guy, was really in the fundamentalist camp. Then there was and he was also an attorney, so he understood the law side. The attorney for the defense, the attorney that was backing up this gentleman, he followed a philosophy that was more modernist. So they debated back and forth. And what it was interesting. So the prosecution, which this gentleman with the last name of Brian was a part of, his whole thing is the theory of evolution is against the Bible. The Bible is the absolute word of God. We should follow the Bible and not follow these abominable philosophies of men that are out there. The defense, their argument was that the Bible isn't completely accurate, and there's some cracks in it, and we need to be open to examining these cracks and challenging some of these notions, which the fundamentalists absolutely pushed out of the way. They're like, nope, the Bible's perfect as is. It's the literal word of God. It cannot be changed. It's perfect the way it's worded. There's no need for change. And again, the modernists are going, I don't know about that. If we really look at it from an objective scientific standpoint, there's problems in there. So they went back and forth. The judge was obviously a pro-fundamentalist because the defense wanted to bring up people to talk about the Bible and demonstrate that not all Christians believe the Bible to be perfect. But the judge wouldn't allow them to do that. So what the defense did, and this changed the whole case, and this is a really cool case to study and learn if you want to get into religious history, especially American religious history. I think this is a landmark case that's well worth studying. I've actually going to get a couple books on it myself to study more about this. Um, the defense called Brian to the stand and asked him about his beliefs in the Bible. He talked about Jonah. Are you sure, Jonah? He's like, yes, I believe that could happen. It is possible. Like whales are big enough to do that. It's possible that is true. And then the defense asked Brian, hey, uh, what about the creation period? Let's go into Genesis and read about this. Is this true? And so the gentleman, Brian, started to kind of waver on it because even though he claimed, he taught this idea that the Bible is absolute and true, he himself did not believe that the creation periods were days, like 24-hour periods. That God suddenly created all this stuff in 24 hours, and the next 24 hours created all this other stuff. And went through this, the idea of a day in the creation was more metaphorical, not literal. And so, because Brian admitted that he interpreted the Bible in that way, they lost. So they technically didn't lose because the judge cited and found this guy guilty of breaking the law of teaching, but they only fined him like $100 and sent him on his way. Basically, they didn't like throw the book at him or nothing, because really the defense actually won the case, but the fundamentalists were in control of the court, and so they didn't technically win, but they actually did win. So a fascinating case. Oh man, if you want to get into something, the monkey trials, such a wild idea of in American religious history. So I'm gonna get some more books and study on that one some more. So we went over so much stuff in my Mormonism class. It was awesome. Also, the book that we read for my graduate class is this one, Thank You, St. Jude. This is a heck of a book. Oh my gosh. So obviously it's, St. Jude. This is a Catholic book. You can kind of see by the cover here a little bit about Catholicism. This is a really great book. Robert Orsi, who wrote it, is a Catholic, and he's not like a super devout Catholic, but he is born and raised Catholic. This is all about the idea of devotion to the saints. So in Catholicism, they believe that some people can reach a level of spirituality where they become a saint. These saints are people who can intercede in behalf of us mortals to talk to Jesus about getting things done. Mary, Jesus' mother, was one of the first saints. She's seen as, if you can't get to Jesus, Jesus is so amazing and great, you can't talk to him. So we're going to go through his mother, Mary, and see if she will talk to him about helping us in our life as an intercessory to Jesus. And so the idea of sainthood takes off after this. We've heard of St. Patrick's Day. He's a Catholic saint. St. Jude is a Catholic saint. St. Paul. These are Catholic saints. So this is an interesting one. St. Jude is a little known saint in the Catholic theology. He is known as the patron saint of hopeless causes. And so what happens is, as immigrants are coming to America, like we talked about in my the Mormonism class, lots of immigrants are coming into America in the early 1900s, and they're running into problems. They can't get good jobs because it's all unskilled labor. There's all kinds of cultural issues and challenges. They're being forced to give up old traditions from their fatherlands and adopt this Americanized idea of thinking here in America, which is changing traditions and values. So the problem with all this is that women got the brunt of the issues. Catholic women were in just a no-win situation because as women, they couldn't have many jobs. They weren't working as much outside the home, so they're relying on their husbands for everything. They had to deal with the sick kids and sick families and things. They didn't have as good of a extended family connection because they immigrated. So there's lots of struggles and challenges that were going on in Catholicism and Christianity at the time. Were pushing against women doing things. Women should. It came down to basically women should suffer in silence. Just suck it up, be a good Catholic, and don't talk about your pain. But your pain is God given to you. So you're blessed if you're in a lot of pain. So women were really blessed a lot in the 1900s. So they kind of, the women were just kind of like, I can't go talk to people, I can't convey my messages, because of World War One. There was a lot of men that died in World War One, so I lost my husband, have to go find somebody else, or they came back with PTSD and they were now alcoholics and having other problems, or men were having affairs and other stuff, so they couldn't trust their husbands. So there's no one for the women to turn to, and so they turned to Saint Jude. Around 1929, the practice of devotion to St. Jude started to take off in Chicago, and it turned into its own phenomenon. And that's what Robert Orsi talks about in this book, is he follows these stories of women and how they relied on St. Jude. And they used him as kind of a gestalt therapy to deal with emotions. And some women would just talk to St. Jude. They had these little, for devotion theology, you could get like cards, prayer cards to write your concerns on, to submit them to St. Jude. You could write a message to St. Jude and slip it in by the monument to St. Jude in the Catholic Church. Lots of different things. You could buy a little coin with a picture of St. Jude on it, or a little statue of St. Jude to put in your house. And women would talk to this statue, let out their fears and concerns. They would pray to the statue if their children or their friends had problems. And so it became this big prayer devotion to St. Jude. The problem is that women themselves couldn't do anything to help other people. So all they could do was to pray to St. Jude and tell other women, you need to pray to St. Jude too. And it became this devotion that really took off. And it's a fascinating book. If you want to understand Catholicism and devotional ideas, it's a really good book to read for that perspective. We discussed it in my class yesterday, and oh my gosh, learned that there's a whole other level of understanding scholarship through this book that was just mind-blowing to think about. So it's an interesting idea of devotions and things. Some scholars look at these types of ideas and go, it's all fake, it's all imaginary, these women are just, it's all psychological, there is no God, there is no spirits out there that can really do these things for you. Just because a woman prays to ask St. Jude, to ask Jesus to help bless her son who's in the war, doesn't mean that her son suddenly gets a shift change and he's now on KP duty instead of on patrol, and then he doesn't die when the enemy attacks. It's not that St. Jude changed the duty roster for them. So scholarship tries to keep God out of it, because God is this unknown factor in things. Whereas he talks about in this book that, yes, you could look at this, that in a way, prayer kind of forced these women to stay in these negative situations because they were waiting for St. Jude to help them, but also accepting the fact that St. Jude might not help them at the same time. Whereas, though, as much as the scholarly works would say that believing in a God, believing in these ethereal ideas is baloney, to these women it made a real difference. Praying to St. Jude gave them the confidence to do things like divorce a bad husband, go get a job, reach out to other people, pray and ask for guidance and help, do other things. So whether St. Jude is legit or real or not, it made a difference for these women. And you cannot deny the experience these women had. In fact, in this book, Robert talks about an experience when he was on a plane and a problem arose, and he actually said a prayer to St. Jude and things got better. Not that he believes in St. Jude or thinks that was, he's kind of in his mind, he's not a believer in St. Jude, but also his prayer worked too. So there's this conundrum between scholarship and what we'd call theology or religion, that goes back and forth. And the thing that's interesting about his book is the conclusion he comes to is there is no conclusion. They're both valid arguments. Scholarship and theology are valid arguments, but there's no way to make them work, and that's okay. You just have to figure it out, which one are you going to go with, basically. So fascinating book. If you like religious history or like scholarship, then this is a book that you absolutely want to read. If you don't like religious history or scholarship, but just think, I'd like to learn more about Catholicism, that would be a good book to read for you too. But it was a great book, a really interesting book. Just, man, my brain was fried after our class yesterday. I think most everybody was confused and brain fried after the class too. It was really a fascinating discussion that we had about that book. So thanks, Dr. Mason, for giving us all the headache from that. It was a good headache. It was really a good thing for us to learn and think deeper about the scholarship, especially in a graduate program. That's something important for us to be thinking about. And I appreciate those insights through the whole class, in fact, that you've given us. So that's my update for this week. It was a heck of a week. Still working on my paper, my final paper, getting it down. I'm focusing it on the first article of faith. What were the general authorities saying? How did they interpret the first article of faith? What did that mean? So I'll share maybe in the next couple of weeks some more insights on that as we continue forward. This is week 12. We only have like 2 full weeks of class. Technically, there's 3 weeks because of the Thanksgiving week. That's kind of a week off. So we have next week and then Thanksgiving week and then the final week of class, basically. So it's crazy that we're coming here to the end of this semester. I did get signed up for next semester. And I'll talk about that as we get closer to the end of this semester, what I'm taking next semester in spring and what those classes mean as well. So thanks for watching. Share these videos out to more people that you think would be interested in wanting to learn these things also. And watch our daily videos. We do a lot of great videos on the scriptures and helping people understand the scriptures better, among other things as well. We got a lot of content for you to view. So like the video, let us know any questions you have in the comments, and we'll see you next week.